February 12, 1946. Camp Concordia, Kansas. In the vast mess hall, 600 German prisoners of war sit in absolute silence. Before them, plates of hot food grow cold, steam curling into the frigid air. The American guards shift on their feet, their expressions a mix of confusion and unease. This isn't a typical prison protest. These men aren't rebelling against their captivity. They're rebelling against being freed. A man named Hans Schmidt stands, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "We will not eat," he announces, "until we are guaranteed we will not be sent back to Germany." This single act of defiance reveals a bizarre, hidden truth of World War II. For these men, the enemy wasn't America. The enemy was the idea of going home. Colonel Francis Howard, the camp commander, held orders straight from Washington. All German POWs were to be sent back to Germany immediately. It was the end of the war, time to go home. But instead of cheers and celebration, panic swept through the camp. The prisoners would rather starve in an American prison than face the freedom that awaited them in their shattered homeland. This wasn't a hunger strike for better conditions. It was a desperate plea to remain prisoners. Why? Because for thousands of German soldiers, returning to Germany meant returning to a living hell. Imagine you're a German soldier, captured on the battlefields of North Africa or Normandy. You've been indoctrinated with propaganda, told that the Americans are monsters who will torture and execute you. You are terrified. But when you arrive at a POW camp in the middle of America, the reality is so different, it feels like a dream. Instead of torture, you are given meals packing for 1,000 calories a day, more than what many American civilians were eating at the time. The camps weren't just barbed wire and guard towers. They had libraries, sports leagues, even full orchestras and theater groups. Prisoners were paid 80 cents a day for their work, a small fortune to men who had nothing. They published their own camp newspapers, took classes, and some even built incredible, miniature German villages to pass the time. They drank Coca-Cola. They ate roast beef and ice cream, luxuries that were distant memories in war-torn Germany. By 1945, over 425,000 German POWs were living like this across more than 700 camps in the United States. They were safe, they were well-fed, and they were far from the fighting. But the real transformation, the one that changed their hearts and minds, happened outside the wire. Due to labor shortages, thousands of prisoners were sent to work on American farms. Here, the lines between captor and captive blurred into something completely unexpected: friendship. They worked side by side with American farmers. They ate dinner at their tables, sharing meals with their families. They learned English from the farmers' children, who saw them not as enemies, but as curiosities. As men, they celebrated American holidays, were invited to community gatherings, and formed deep, lasting bonds. Some even fell in love, forging forbidden romances that defied the logic of war. Through these daily interactions, they discovered a shocking truth. The enemy they were taught to hate was kinder, more generous, and more humane than their own government. The America they experienced was a world away from the caricature painted by Nazi propaganda. Meanwhile, letters from home painted a grim, terrifying picture. Their families described a Germany that no longer existed. Cities bombed into rubble, starvation becoming the norm, a nation carved up by the Allies. The contrast between their peaceful life in America and the apocalyptic wasteland their country had become was unbearable. The good life in the POW camp had become a golden cage, and the thought of leaving it was terrifying. Then, in January of 1946, the official order came down. All German POWs were to be repatriated by the summer. For the American public, it was a logical end to the war. For the prisoners, it was a death sentence. Dread spread like a virus through the camps. The Germany they were being sent back to was a nightmare. Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, once proud cities, now just mountains of debris. Millions were homeless, wandering the ruins. Food rations were cut to starvation levels. Families were scattered, with countless people missing or dead. And for those assigned to the Soviet-occupied zone, repatriation meant facing a new kind of prison, or worse. Their old lives, their homes, their entire world had been erased. So they began to resist, not with weapons, but with words. Petitions were drafted, pleading with President Truman to let them stay, even if it meant remaining prisoners indefinitely. At Camp Concordia, 347 men signed. At other camps, the numbers were just as high, 289 here, 412 there, 500 at another. They were begging to stay in the country they had been sent to fight. The official answer was a firm no. International law, specifically the Geneva Convention, required that all prisoners of war be returned to their home country once the conflict ended. There would be no exceptions. And that's when the desperation boiled over into open rebellion. The hunger strike at Concordia wasn't an isolated incident. Across the country, prisoners organized work slowdowns, refusing to perform their duties. They filed legal appeals, hoping for a loophole. They wrote thousands of desperate letters to anyone they thought might listen. Farmers they had worked for, government officials, anyone. The psychological toll was immense. Some prisoners, so terrified of returning to a world of nothing, attempted to take their own lives. At night, in the quiet of the barracks, a strange sound could sometimes be heard. It was the sound of German soldiers, men who once sang anthems of the Third Reich, now quietly singing American folk songs like You Are My Sunshine and Home on the Range. It was their quiet, heartbreaking declaration that they no longer belonged to Germany. They had become something new, something forged in the fields and kitchens of their enemy. Despite the protests, the hunger strikes, and the desperate pleas, the deportations went ahead as planned. The process was cold and methodical. Trucks would arrive at the camps, ready to transport the men to ships waiting on the coasts. The farewells were deeply emotional. At the fences of the camps, local communities gathered to say goodbye. Farmers who had come to see the prisoners as sons or friends stood with tears in their eyes. American guards, who had overseen the camps for years, felt a sense of guilt, as if they were complicit in sending these men to their doom. The prisoners themselves, stripped of their hope, looked like men heading to an execution, not a homecoming. By July of 1946, the camps were empty. The strange, vibrant world of the German POWs in America had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. What happened to them? For most, the return was as brutal as they had feared. They stepped off the ships into a landscape of rubble and hunger. Many of those sent to the Soviet-controlled eastern zones were immediately imprisoned again, viewed with suspicion as potential Western spies, and some disappeared forever into the Gulag. But some stories had different endings. A few, driven by the memory of their time in America, managed to find their way back years later. A man who had learned carpentry in a Texas camp returned in 1952 to start a new life. A former prisoner who had taught German in a camp school eventually became a high school instructor in the U.S. In one incredible case, a prisoner who had been unofficially adopted by a Missouri farming family managed to return to them in 1953. And what about those forbidden romances? One American woman famously gave up her U.S. citizenship to marry her German pal lover and moved to his broken country, choosing love over homeland. But these were the exceptions. The vast majority of the 425,000 prisoners never saw America again. They slowly rebuilt their lives in a divided and traumatized Germany, forever carrying the memory of the enemy land where, for a brief time, they had felt safer and more at home than anywhere else on Earth. So why has this incredible chapter of World War II been almost completely forgotten? Why don't we hear about the prisoners who didn't want to leave? Because the story is uncomfortable. It challenges the simple narratives we tell ourselves about war. For America, it raised difficult questions. In many parts of the country, particularly in the segregated South, these German prisoners of war were treated with more dignity and given better living conditions than Black American citizens living just miles from the camps. For Germany, it contradicted the post-war narrative of national victimhood and unwavering loyalty. It revealed that thousands of its own soldiers, when given a choice, preferred the kindness of their captors to the ideology of their leaders. But most importantly, this story was forgotten because it humanizes the enemy. It reminds us that armies are made of people. These weren't all die-hard Nazi fanatics. Many were just ordinary men, farmers, mechanics, teachers swept up in the horrors of history. They were transformed not by force, but by simple acts of kindness, by shared work, by friendship, and by their first real taste of a free and open society. Their hunger strike wasn't a rebellion against a prison. It was a rebellion against being forced out of a sanctuary and back into a shattered world. They weren't fighting for Germany or for Hitler. They were fighting for a future, a glimmer of hope they had glimpsed across an American dinner table. Their resistance ultimately failed, but their forgotten story leaves us with a powerful legacy. It shows us that war can turn enemies into neighbors, that captivity can sometimes reveal our shared humanity, and that sometimes the most difficult journey of all is the one back home. Thank you for watching. If you found this hidden history as fascinating as I do, please like this video and subscribe for more stories that have been left in the footnotes of our past.